Let's go to the pharmaceutical industry, since you're kind of the perfect person to ask about this. You've done a lot in quantum computing, a lot in AI, and specifically the applications it could have in the pharmaceutical industry. You also work daily on the effects, if I'm not mistaken, of AI in pharmaceuticals.
Yes.
So let's talk first about AI in drug discovery and then AI in drug manufacturing. Very recently, I made my first YouTube video, and it was about the discovery of the first ever single electron covalent bond. So basically, for those who don't know the context, chemical bonds in the covalent type should have two electrons. For the first time, we discovered the chemical bond, a covalent one, with a single electron, which was only theorized by Pauling many, like almost a century ago. But the thing is, all the biochemical reactions, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me, that we know and use to develop drugs are the ones which we have identified. But the thing is, if there are more chemical bonding that takes place which we haven't identified, there could also be more chemical interactions taking place, and we just didn't have any means of measuring it. So, what could AI do in terms of that?
A lot of things actually. I mean, today, if you were to look at how we use machine learning for drug discovery itself, like in early discovery, it takes quite a few forms here. First is that you are really looking, when you're talking about a disease, for example, you're really looking at something known as, target, like the targets that can be implicated in a disease. So, for example, like if you're looking at some kind of a set of symptoms for which a certain protein expression is kind of like responsible for it, then if you can essentially mitigate the action of that protein or the expression of that protein, then you could have a viable therapeutic candidate. So that protein essentially becomes a target then, or a pathway within the expression of that protein becomes a target. So you could use machine learning to discover some of these, disease pathways and basically better understand disease biology. You could actually then design molecular structures that can be used to, bind to particular targets.
So basically, chemical interactions that in different times we would try to perform in a lab setting, but now AI could predict which chemical molecule is going to form a bond with another chemical molecule.
Yes, I mean, there is that, and also beyond that. I mean, if you were to look at, say, for example, like normally in a lab, you have to do these experiments in iterative fashion based on first principles understanding of chemistry. You could have a computational simulation of a lot of these, reactions and reaction mechanisms and binding affinities and whatnot in parallel over a large amount of, data. So you could have a lot more throughput essentially in terms of identifying those, entities that can bind to targets appropriately and within the other constraints that you have to consider in terms of their toxicity, efficacy, and other kinds of mechanistic safety aspects, etc. So one of the things to think about here is this. Normally, when you have to talk about, for example, you have a particular protein structure, let's say, that is implicated in a particular disease, and you could do well to actually reduce the expression of that protein or, mitigate the function of that protein in a biological pathway. You could design a complementary protein to that and try to get it to bind to that. And historically, designing some of these in a pre-AI era would mean an iterative design over many years, for example, because you have to consider a lot of other, characteristics and a lot of other constraints, along with the fact that you need to design a complement of a particular target. And today it is possible using a lot of generative chemistry algorithms to consider a lot of these constraints and come up with a whole range of molecular structures in one afternoon. And, that was possible to do this in, let's say, a year or so. So that is the kind of efficiency gain that we're talking about in early discovery. So this is one of the ways in which machine learning has revolutionized the early discovery stage. And increasingly, there are efforts to add more and more constraints from further in the pipeline to inform this molecular design phase. Like, increasingly, there are companies that are trying to incorporate data from ADME characteristics, adsorption, distribution, metabolism, expression characteristics based on historical data for similar molecules, etc., and design particular molecular structures that possibly have a better efficacy profile or a safety profile. So these are the kind of things we are talking about. Like in a nutshell, we are talking about machine learning, allowing this iterative discovery to happen really fast considering a far larger range of constraints and allowing for this candidate generation or lead generation to happen in a much more streamlined manner than was ever possible in human history.
So expanding on that, could we say that there could be potential for, let's say, a doctor to have a patient who has a very rare condition or even a condition which they haven't diagnosed yet, and to use AI to develop a drug very, very quickly, which is specifically targeted to the exact needs of the patient's disease immediately?
So I'm not sure about the immediately part, but then again, that is something that we can discuss about later. But in a much more practical time scale, yes. I mean, what you're talking about is essentially the core of precision medicine, that you are considering the patient as an individual with their own individual genomic, metabolic, proteomic, and environmental and demographic history, and using that to essentially propose what appropriate therapeutic interventions might be proposed for specific conditions that they may have. And we do see an emergence of this line of thinking for a lot of specific kinds of cancers, for example, where there is a lot of understanding that, targeted therapeutic interventions are most likely to succeed, in a longer term than having generic kind of like therapeutic administrations that are essentially estimated on a population scale or essentially estimated using kind of like a symptomatic approach. So in theory, yes, I mean, the future clinic should be able to be precise in terms of the therapy that it proposes for individual patients, and algorithms that are able to integrate all of this patient level information will play a critical role in it. And essentially, my hunch is that the way this will end up working in practice is that while patient profiles would be mapped by algorithms to suggest appropriate lines of treatment, the actual treatments themselves will be chosen from a catalog of options that are created for different patient phenotypes, as opposed to making it strictly individual and designing a therapy right on the spot.
Okay. I mean, from what I have understood, we see a huge shift towards personalized medicine. So medicine being specific to the exact needs of the patient, because every organism is different. Everyone's organism works in a different way. With cholesterol, some people are affected from high cholesterol, some people are not affected this much from high cholesterol, and so on.
Yeah, something to think about here is this. We talk a lot about, precision medicine in the context of things already being wrong, in the sense that the patient already having become a patient. But we could think of it more on a holistic healthcare side as well. Like how do you actually precisely tailor proactive healthcare for individual needs? So, for example, I'm a South Asian individual, and because of my unique genetic history and because of my, the unique epigenetic manifestations thereof, I am more susceptible to, let's say, cardiac events and things like diabetes, etc., than the average population in the West, just to give an example. And therefore, there is no reason why I need to be prescribed the exact same dietary interventions or the exact same fitness routines in my routine fitness checks or the routine healthcare checks as everybody else. So I would think that the precision medicine should come in on more on the preventive and the proactive side and on the reactive side.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree. Is that happening, or could that happen in the next couple of years?
So that is happening. Like, you do have essentially a lot more activity in that direction in the space of like startups and ventures, and more on the wellness side of things rather than in the, the healthcare administration side of things. More health systems, while they talk about it, at a surface level, but purely in terms of a more proactive deployment, we still have some miles to go.
All right. So, in terms of drug manufacturing, how exactly are you using AI yourself when it comes to the process of drug manufacturing?
Well, I mean, as it comes to manufacturing as a process itself, like you have, I mean, very clear needs when it comes to things like addressing quality concerns, addressing supply chain efficiencies, addressing the assembly line efficiencies, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
So
if I'm not mistaken, I think I had read in a meta-analysis that about 90% of drugs fail in clinical trials.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, clinical trials come way before the manufacturing even begins. So that's a whole different, story that we are talking about. But talk about manufacturing first. So, for example, something as simple as, whether or not, there is an overflow of pills when you're filling it into a jar. You have essentially cameras monitoring it in a lot of like shop floors. Even monitoring and analyzing this kind of a thing today, you can have algorithms to do that. So something as simple to more complicated things around supply chain optimization and scheduling efficiency optimization and predictive maintenance in the shop floor. All of those things, like in other industries, by the way, you do have this in other industries as well. We do see a fair amount of value creation using machine learning or generally AI systems. Speaking of clinical trial design, that is a whole process in itself. Like one of the core concerns that we have when you design clinical trials is appropriately recruiting the relevant subjects and creating the subject and the control cohorts. And you'd be surprised how bad people are at answering questions about themselves in these kind of things. So I've seen all kinds of some of the papers I've reviewed in this space in a lot of these AI conferences. I've seen all kinds of things like there was this paper that talked about actually having mobile camera apps that would require clinical trial subjects to record videos of them taking a pill and then uploading it so that the AI could assess that whether or not they took the pill at the right amount of time and actually took the pill for that matter before they reported what their symptoms or remissions thereof were. So as such, like a lot of these are essentially human factors adjustments that we need to consider during making selections for clinical trial cohorts, and that is where machine learning plays a lot of a role. And also, like a lot of the chatbots that are used today to actually do some of this recruitment, there is a lot of scope for having LLM powered systems based on historical data for patient creation and patient cohort selection. You have companies doing it, like you have clinical trial providers like IQVIA, etc., that do offer this kind of competency from what I know.
Yeah, yeah. So how about responsibility and its role in all of this conversation? Let's say that an AI makes a huge error and it fails. Is that the responsibility of AI or the person who trained it?
Yeah, so this is something where the jurisprudence is not very clear yet. I mean, you do have a lot of talk about treating this essentially as a case of intermediary responsibility, but given that a lot of these algorithms essentially come with a fairly black box kind of like a formalism where you do not have first principles way of explaining a lot of their decision making, there isn't exactly a clear jurisprudence on what the chain of responsibility should be. So a lot of the focus has been like if you look at the OECD guidelines about risks of using AI systems, etc. A lot of the EU guidelines around the AI Act and so on and so forth. All of that focuses heavily on this idea on the that let's actually not focus so much on who is responsible when AI gets something wrong, etc. But let's actually regulate the usage side itself. Like if an AI were to get something wrong, then what is the potential harm that may be caused in different sectors? And accordingly, let's actually regulate to what extent AI agents can be used as parts of the process. So that right is a way of looking at it, where you are not really talking about individual responsibility, but you're kind of like saying that, okay, let's not use these systems where such a compliance issue might in itself. Not best approach in my understanding either, but I don't see a lot of other options if you have to run a very advanced, sort
Mm.
of responsibility have to be assigned to someone. So